Well, we can see people freaking out about housing prices. So, in some parts of the country, they're freaking out about it. In other parts of the country, things are still going well. And people need to take a step back, because there's a bunch of people on X misleading you down the path, saying that it's all about housing prices are all about population growth or lack thereof. And the sky is falling. And we're going to break it down and bring receipts. So.
Well, I mean, put it into context. I mean, people who are in Vancouver, people who are in the GTA, yeah, things are being affected there. But, in the middle of Canada and on the outskirts, like, things are not the same as in those highly populated areas with inflated housing prices, right?
True. Even in Vancouver, if you're looking at like the most desirable properties, nothing has moved. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like it's still high. Yeah. You're looking in not the AAA grade locations. You're looking in the AA locations, because I'm always looking at stuff in Vancouver when I'm there. So. Let's jump into it and kind of give people the context of what people are seeing.
Sure.
Here is our real estate map that we post all the time here. And you can see BC down 4.1%. Northwest Territories down 4.4%. BC down 4.1%. Northwest Territories, I always take it with a bit of a grain of salt, because they're like small markets. So when you see large percentage change in small markets, it's like it's not. It's more. It can be a statistical anomaly. So you really got to look at this over time, right? But in BC, 4.1%. That's a large market.
Mm-hmm, okay? Sure.
$960,000. People in Alberta. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, they're like, what the heck's going on? The real estate market is fantastic. What are these guys talking about, right? And then Ontario, they're down by 3.6%. Okay. And it's an oversimplification that people have. You can also see Newfoundland down by 8.5%, but, simultaneously, Quebec up by 8.4%, right? And so the tendency with housing prices, a lot of it comes from, realtors who want to sell you a house or something like that. They'll oversimplify it on that it's just population, that it's population and only population, okay? And probably what really got this discussion going with a lot of people is just the actual population. So you're looking at the Q2 population in Canada there. And essentially stuck at 41.5 million. I'm going to count the difference, is just, statistically insignificant here. 41.5 million. So zero population growth in the quarter, which is, looking back, it's like that is, one of the lowest numbers ever.
Sure.
Ever recorded, 41.5 million. But simultaneously, it's coming off some of the highest increases in history here too. So you start looking at some of these increases. They're pretty significant. Kind of looking year over year. For example, if you're looking for Q4 2021 to Q4 2022, we're moving from 38.4 million to 39.2 million. Okay. And then from Q4 2022, from 39.2 to Q4 2023 to 40.5 million. Okay. And then 40.5 million to, basically 41.4 million, almost a full million people in one calendar year.
And,
right?
That's pretty significant. A million people per year for a few years straight. That's kind of a big deal.
Big deal. Yeah. But as I always tell people, when in doubt, zoom out. Zoom out. And that's what we're going to do, and we're going to show you, because you start to look at these aggregate prices here, and I've seen this chart shared around online, and you can see the housing index top in Q1 2022 in Canada and then sink dramatically. But of course, it's a much different it's a much different discussion depending on which region of the country that you're in, okay? A much different, discussion depending on what region of the country that you're in, okay? And so population growth is one variable and only one variable. And I would argue it's actually not the biggest variable. and the biggest variable almost nobody ever talks about, and I will tell you what the biggest variable is.
All right.
Okay, and so here's the the data. This is the actual data. Okay, so we talk about population increases. Yes, okay, population increase. It matters. How many people are looking for houses? That matters. Okay, and people will talk about supply. They will talk about the supply of houses, okay? But the variable they never talk about is the dollars you're using to buy the houses. And that is the most significant variable in the entire equation, okay? And the realtors don't talk about it. The mortgage brokers don't talk about it. The people who sell you investments at the bank don't talk about it. But the dollars that we're using to buy them, what is the value? What is the number of those dollars in circulation here, okay? So I've assembled some data for you here. And this data is, we're looking at the M2 money supply, the broad money supply in trillions of dollars in Canada. Okay. Trillions of dollars. Comically enough, we, in 1971, and there's a reason why we start in 1971. We teach everyone at the boot camp of what changed at that point. $40 billion in circulation. $40 billion.
Just $40 billion.
$40 billion. That's like, less than our annual deficit today. That's less than the annual deficit in Canada today. And then we also look at the population increase. 1971, there was 22 million people in Canada.
So roughly half.
22 million people.
20 million less than what we have today. So.
That's right. Yep. And then the number of housing units. Now, we've gone through a couple different statistical changes since 1971 and how they're counting housing units, but different sources, but I've tried to smooth it out for people. But there were 6.4 million housing units, the actual stock of housing, right? Because people, they keep talking about this. It's like, oh, we don't have enough units. But when was the last time you heard in parliamentary debate of how many units? How many do we have? How many population is too high? How many did we increase, right? How many housing units? It's kind of difficult to search through the data, so they don't want to actually prepare for it. So, and then we get the average price of a house. And you could have bought a house for $123,000 way back in 1971. Yeah. So. Wow. Not bad.
The average price. So imagine buying a house in, Toronto or the GTA for $123,000. That's incredible.
Yeah, just on average, you 5x your money. Not a bad deal, right?
Right.
That's the bag of potatoes, okay, that they talk about. Yeah. So, okay, and that's a housing unit. So that's an average between the small condos and the single family houses.
Yeah,
that's an average. Okay. Let's fast forward to today, and everyone is talking about that population increase. It's like that population increase, it's choppy, okay? But I would suggest, I don't really, I don't have the highest degree of faith in the government to get this exactly right every quarter. Like, I'm posting these numbers. We know that they amend these numbers all the time. So they amend them all the time. When we're posting the current month's numbers, they often amend the prior month's numbers or the prior quarter's numbers. So, I would suggest that, slow down, people. The population decrease in any quarter could be a statistical anomaly. Okay?
Yeah,
you need to zoom out. But even the population increase that led up to this, most people are going to be absolutely shocked when I show them. Is they would think, I'm sure if you ask the average person, that the population increase in the last 25 years has been absolutely dramatic. And
asking anybody today, that's what you're going to get. They're going to say, oh, the population has grown, astronomically in the last little bit. But you know what? Like we talked about just before the podcast, is like, okay, so we had very, very low, but then 1 million people per year, 3 years in a row. Yeah, that feels like
completely disorganized chaos.
Yeah, that feels like ridiculous.
Complete chaos. Yeah. But ultimately, these numbers start to even out, and in a way that should give you a predictable methodology to make financial decisions. That's the goal here, right? It's like not what should they do, it's what they're going to do and how you should play it to build wealth for you and your family. Okay. And so this will be the absolute surprising most surprising part for most people, is the compound annual growth rate for population in Canada in the last 54 years has been 1.2%. In the last 25 years, it has also been 1.2%. It's not as abrupt as everyone thinks it is. It was complete chaos.
Yeah, sure.
You could argue about the quality and the expertise of the people that came into the country, and going from 1 million people in a year to 0 people coming in one quarter, like completely unnecessary. Puts a lot of strain on the system and infrastructure. It's not organized at all. But when you're zooming out, when you're trying to make an investment decision, that's less important.
Right.
It's less important. Okay. And what actually is like we've been 1.2% for 54 years in Canada. That's been our population increase. And so I would suggest anybody betting on the population increase to stagnate is wrong. And anybody betting that it was going to go for, continue on at 3%, also likely wrong. Okay. Because these increases were wild, 2.3%, 3.1%, 2.5%. But you can see it follows 2020. That was one of the lowest population increases on history because nobody was traveling. Nobody was moving. Sure. It was hard to get, work permits, done. It's like people weren't getting foreign student permits. Like no one was coming in. Okay. So it's one of the slowest population growth periods in history. And then, we look at 1 quarter here at 0%. When you start averaging this stuff out here, it's, you start averaging that out, it's, 1.6%. Higher, but not probably the range that people thought it was going to be.
Right.
Okay. Now, we talk a lot about housing units. Okay. Here's where you start to see housing units. Okay. How many housing units? We actually had, some pretty decent growth of housing units. We had 1.9%, 1.2%, and then 3%, 1.8% in 2024. And really the completion of housing units has also fallen off a cliff. Developers are very hesitant. Yeah. They don't have a lot of money to spend. It's like it's 0%. But here's where you start to see a deviation where the population increase has been 1.2% pretty consistently for 54 years. Same in the 54-year compound annual growth rate as it has been in the 25-year compound annual growth rate. Our construction of housing units has not, though. It has not been the same, okay? We have increased the number of housing units in Canada on a compound annual growth rate over 54 years, 1.9%. But when you look at the last 25 years, it's only 1.4%. Okay, it's only
that's not good. So you can chalk up a few different things to that, like the regulations, permitting. The municipalities really, charging a lot extra for development permits, time to get permitting and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of a big deal and probably relates somewhat to that growth, but. What's the big deal? What's the biggest problem with getting things developed?
It's people. Like it's actually hard to build things. So it's financing. It's financing and people. That are really. It's not that people don't want to buy houses. Like the customer's part is pretty easy. People want to buy houses.
Sure.
Okay. But can you get the financing? If you're a developer, can you get the financing? A and B, if you can get the financing, if you can get that financing, do you have the people to build it? Do you actually have the expertise to build it? Okay. Yeah. Because we work with small developers all the time. It's like some of them, if they had more money, it took years to train the people that we have.
Yeah, for sure.
And, you get 1 million people entering the country, but they're all taking, some sort of, business admin degree at some university that no one's heard of before. It's like, who's putting in the ductwork on that house? You know what I mean? Who's installing the furnace there? Who's wiring that house? Not that guy, right?
For sure.
That might be 10 years before that person with no skills is actually productive in this whole process. So that is that is the number, people. We've only increased the number of units by 1.4% on average. That's the compound annual growth rate in the last 25 years. And I would suggest the desirability for, it's not like people are living in the same house with the same size of family. The size of household per person is actually decreasing. So you actually need more units per person if, people aren't having 3, 4, 5, 6 kids.
Well, especially like, young people who are maybe just cohabitating together, not planning on having any children, 1 or 2, and then they just need a small apartment unit. So that counts as one of these units here. And, a lot of younger people, the outlook doesn't look great for them, and they don't feel hopeful for the future that they're ever going to be able to afford a home. Now, again, going back to, where you live matters. So if you go into a smaller center, someplace, in rural Saskatchewan or a smaller town in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta even, you can get an affordable place to live. You just have to, set your expectations of a different lifestyle, right? But if everybody wants to congregate into the city, you got to be prepared to, save up for that down payment, and then have all the criteria ready so that you can actually borrow the funds to get that unit.
That's right. Yeah. And so here's where you start to see what happened in the change in prices here is, housing prices on a 54-year basis, 3.2%. But in the last 25 years, 5.3%. So the compound annual, despite the depressed market today, which really affects the calculation, because if you're running this calculation a year ago, you're getting a number north of 6%.
Right.
Okay, so despite the market today being in a trough, it's still a 5.3% compound annual growth rate in the last 25 years. Okay, now the discerning person should ask that question: is if our population is increasing by 1%, and the number of housing units appears to somewhat keeping up. We just have to understand it's not quite keeping up because fewer people are occupying a housing unit because the size of families are shrinking. Where does the extra growth come from? You know what I mean? Like, well, why is it 3.2%? Why is it 5.3%? Right? They told us the inflation was 2%. Right. Where does this 3.2%, where does 5.3% come from? Okay, that's the compound annual growth rate. It's because of the single most important factor in every financial decision, which is the money supply. It is in the long term, it's the money supply. Okay, and we've grown the money supply on a 54-year basis at 8.2%. Okay, you really have to understand how the first kind of 10 to 15 years off the gold standard affected this whole thing. It's like, people are usually bamboozled on why inflation was so high in the 80s, and they have all sorts of, misunderstandings about oil prices and things like that. It's like, no, because they jacked the money supply to rates that we had never seen before ever. That's why the inflation rate went so high. Increases in the money supply by 25%, 20%, 16%, 14%, 12%. It's like that. That's what happened. That's what led to the massive inflation in the late 70s and early 80s. It was the money supply. Okay. And I'll give you a more recent example is how this affects everything. It's okay. Housing prices topped in 2021. The average price of a house in Canada topped in 2021 at $777,000. But remember, the same people are telling you today that it was all because of population growth. Right. Population growth. But what was the population growth leading up to that? The population growth in 2020 was one of the smallest population growths we had ever seen at 0.5%. And even in 2021, it was still less than the average at 1.1, with the average being 1.2. But that still meant houses grew from 543,000 to 613 to 777. What changed? Not the population. we had the largest increase in the money supply that we'd had in 40 years.
Yeah. So everybody remember that stimulus that they put out. Everybody got a bunch of free money to stay home. That's kind of what fueled this. That's part of what fueled the increase in the money supply, and then the boom in the house prices.
That's right. That's right. And so when you're making a housing decision, okay, the population increase is one variable, okay? But don't just look at the migratory patterns in and out of a neighborhood. You also have to look at the change in supply, okay? And this is where you can get really regional in this part of the calculation, because the migratory patterns are different, right? And you can start to see that play out. It's like, I think we got a population count here too. We could look at, our home province of Alberta at 4.3 million here, and now we're at 4,980,000. So, we had 20,000 new people on 4.9 million, okay? Whereas the entire country combined only had a population increase of 20,000, okay? Mm-hmm. So you start to look at how that works in terms of, we still there's no problem in Alberta, okay? But then you start to look at some of the other provinces that are struggling, okay? And you start to see migratory patterns that relate to this. And this data can be available at more regional levels too, okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even sub-regional levels.
Right, okay? Yeah, we're just taking a zoomed out picture, the whole country as a whole in its entirety, not taking into account the disparity between the regions and so forth. It's just an aggregate amount across it so that people can get a better picture.
That's right. But the part that is going to blow people's minds is, let's say you had no net new people. You have no net new people coming in, and you have no net new housing units being created. So basically, for every housing unit you create, mm-hmm. You demolish one because it ended its useful economic life. Okay, but if you jack the money supply, the housing prices still go up dramatically. They still go up dramatically. Okay, so if you tethered immigration significantly, and you're still meddling along in the number of units, this is still going to be the hammer. It's there comes a point in time that it doesn't actually matter if this is so significant. There's no reasonable expected change in population growth or housing units being built or demolishes, that if the change in the money supply was so dramatic, that's what causes it, right? That's what causes it. And a lot of people go back to why the housing prices were such a struggle in the 90s. It's like, in the 90s, you had some of the slowest M2 money growth ever. And so keep in mind, 8.2% is the average over 54 years, and 7% is the average over the last 25 years. But how tight things were in the 90s, it's like, we're looking at after 1990, then you get 5.4%, 2.6%. I mean, you have a long, long way before you actually get a year that's back to the average. A long way. Like there's 15 years almost there before you get a number that's 7 or more, and including 2 consecutive years with zero growth in the money supply whatsoever.
Yeah, and looking at your chart there, it looks like the housing prices basically remained kind of flat and even decreased. Like you look at, goes from 215 to 191, 180, 70s, all into the 80s. And then they didn't come back up until the 2000s.
Exactly. Yeah. So what was this? This was not a factor of immigration. The population was still increasing at a slower rate, but not at a snail's pace. It's still 1% there. Okay. And the housing units being increased are still fairly decent. This was money supply. This was money supply. Just like, so when people say it, like, when people compare it to the 90s, you have to ask yourself, do you expect the increase in the money supply to be 0% for 2 consecutive years with the WEF banker Mark Carney at the helm. Like, no chance.
way.
There's no chance that that's going to happen. There's zero chance that we're going to have 2 consecutive years of M2 money growth, being 0% increase. Like, that is just not going to happen. We're tight right now. We're on 5.7%. I think he's kind of smart and attuned to this, that he actually knows, that, I guess the pundits out there are telling me, though, the Bank of Canada is completely independent from the Prime Minister. Like, sure it is.
Yeah.